one part of the both of our confessions that gets brought up frequently in this discussion is chapter 8, paragraph 6. Says, although the work of redemption was not actually wrought by Christ till after his incarnation, yet the virtue, efficacy, and benefits thereof were communicated unto the elect in all ages successively from the beginning of the world, in and by those promises, types, and sacrifices wherein he was revealed and signified to be the seed of the woman, which should bruise the serpent's head, and the lamb slain from the beginning of the world, being yesterday and today the same and forever. So the question that arises with this is they feel that that view necessitates their understanding of covenant theology, that you must say that the old covenant is the covenant of grace. And if you don't say that, you can't affirm 8.6. So briefly before diving into that, part of the issue that I've seen, there's a little bit of nebulous discussion of what communicated means. So R. Scott Clark wrote a series of posts or a long post on this and did not accurately represent our view, and each of you wrote responses to that a few years ago. What is the definition of communicated there, Sam? I think you gave me did you stick the Oxford English Dictionary definition in there? So what does the Oxford English Dictionary define communicated as?
Among the various definitions, one of the ones that's contemporary to that time and certainly pertinent to these kinds of semantic contexts is to impart, to transmit, or to give a share of. To communicate is to impart, to transmit, or to give a share of. It has other senses in other contexts, but in that time and in these types of semantic contexts, this is the meaning: giving someone something, getting something to someone.
And specifically here, if we look at the language here, we got to be careful. The language here is saying, what is it that is imparted, transmitted, or given? It is the virtue, efficacy, and benefits of Christ's work of redemption. Those things are imparted to the elect through these means. So if a lot of emphasis here is on the sacrifices, but if we set that aside for a moment and remove that, the statement reads, the benefit thereof were imparted to the elect in all ages successively from the beginning of the world, in those promises wherein he was revealed to be the seed which should bruise the serpent's head, being the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if we isolate it and look at it like that, it's not saying anything different from what we read in chapter 20, paragraph 1, for instance, that the promise of Christ is the effectual means of salvation. So there's nothing there that should present any confusion as to how we could affirm that. The question then gets on to how do types and sacrifices relate? How do they communicate those benefits of Christ to the elect in the Old Testament?
Right. So this is where the entire discussion has been driving, and I believe that this is um, what essentially is where the disagreement is located, and where I believe, in a sense, I don't want to call it the battle, but the discussion needs to take place. Is two level typology or two tier typology and the communication of Christ's grace prior to Christ's coming. So and I understand the question that Camden asked a few times. How does a commitment to 8.6 not entail necessarily a commitment to what we might call Westminster federalism or sort of the majority view of Reformed covenant theology? How does this not commit you to say that the old covenant is an administration of the covenant of grace? And here is where we need to do a better job of explaining our position, but also there needs to be better work done in historical theology to understand the positions that have been held even within the Reformed camp on these matters. So bear with me as I explain this as best as I can. So when we say that the grace of Christ is communicated through promises, types, and sacrifices, we really mean that it is through the promises made known prior to Christ and through the revelation of Christ in types and in particular in the sacrifices. Those are the means by which Old Testament saints knew the promise of the gospel and believed the promise of the gospel and received the grace of Christ promised yet to come. So the grace of Christ is communicated to them. It is imparted to them. They are given a share and portion of it through seeing Jesus Christ to come, Jesus Christ incarnatus, to be incarnate ahead of them. Now, someone would say, well, that requires then a Westminster understanding of covenant theology, because that means that the old covenant was an administration of the covenant of grace. But this is where we have to respond and say that the language of administration is insufficient to properly communicate the nuances of the biblical data on this question, because it's true, and we should not deny that the Old Testament ordinances are, in this sense, administering, communicating, imparting, conferring the grace of Jesus Christ to the faith of the elect in all ages. And someone say, well, you've just given everything away, but that's not true, because we have already stated that because of two-tier typology, it is not the sacrifice in and of itself. It is not the type in and of itself that communicates this, but rather the type in and of itself communicates a different grace, a different blessing. We said, for example, that the animal sacrifices purify the flesh. So a type, such as an animal sacrifice, communicates two different graces: God's free remission of sins in purifying the flesh of an Israelite. That's what it does, and that's what it is. And in itself, that's all it does. But it administers or communicates the grace of Christ insofar as it points you above and beyond itself to something other and greater, namely Christ's sacrifice, Christ's blood, and the perfect and eternal remission of sins that one obtains in him. And so the grace of Christ is administered or communicated through those things, but only secondarily, and only for those who see beyond the type by faith. Whereas everyone who participates in the type in its original context, they receive the remission of sins, the purification of their flesh. But for some, as Dr. Barcelos mentioned earlier, for some of the Israelites, they saw beyond it. They saw above it. They saw what was other and greater in the sacrifices, namely Jesus Christ, not in a non-mysterious way. It was still through mystery. It was still veiled. It was still incomplete. It was still partial, obscure, and dark, and all these things, but it was true. And so just because something is subservient to the covenant of grace, just because something is typical of the covenant of grace, it does not mean that that thing, the type, is the reality itself. It's pointing to the reality. It is its own historical reality pointing on to something else. And so when we talk about the old covenant or the subservient covenant, we're talking about the land of Canaan for the natural offspring of Abraham, who must maintain their purity and holiness to live within that land. And they have a sacrificial system to forgive them and keep them in that land. And that's as far as the old covenant went. And that's what the old covenant did. Now, this, of course, was typical of and therefore subservient to the covenant of grace and made it known to the faith of the elect from its institution onward. So just this is why the language of administration is insufficient. It's nebulous. It does not distinguish the two tiers, the typological or the typical and the antitypical levels of Old Testament symbolism. Administration just doesn't get that specific. And so I'm happy to say that the old covenant administered the grace of the new covenant. And yet I'm also happy to say that the old covenant is different in substance from the new covenant. And it's two-tier typology that does this, which I base on the author to the Hebrews and all the other arguments that the blood of goats and bulls purifies the flesh. And therefore, it cannot be the blood of Christ, and it is not the promise of the old covenant, or the remission that Jesus gives is not the promise of the old covenant. Whereas the blood of Jesus Christ perfects the conscience, brings us into the heavenly holy of holies, and is the better promise of the new covenant, which is distinct, therefore, in substance. So, two-tier typology explains communication and administration, and why we can affirm 8.6 that the grace of Christ, the work of redemption, is brought to the faith of the elect in and by the promises, types, and sacrifices of the Old Testament. And I'm even willing to affirm the language of administration. I just think the language of administration is unhelpful, and for too long has been unhelpful, and is used as a coat that is too broad and covers too much. It's not specific enough. But this is where the misunderstanding takes place.